Welcome, fellow seekers of history's shadows. Before we step into the quiet, candlelit corridors of medieval monasteries, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, whether you're winding down in Manchester, just beginning, your evening in Melbourne, or somewhere in between. I'm grateful you've chosen to join me. If these explorations into the hidden corners of history speak to you, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a descent into the forgotten echoes of the past. Now, take a breath, settle in, and let your thoughts drift back in time to an age when faith and fear were intertwined. When the hope of salvation came with the shadow of condemnation. Picture, if you will, the rolling landscapes of medieval Europe, dotted with grand stone abbeys, whose bells summoned the faithful to prayer. These sacred places, with their vaulted ceilings and illuminated texts, stood as monuments to spiritual aspiration. Yet within their cloistered walls, beyond the hymns and ritual, darker truths often lurked. We've all heard the romantic depictions of medieval monasteries, safe havens of knowledge and kindness, where monks healed the sick and preserved ancient wisdom. Popular culture has cast them as peaceful retreats filled with gentle friars and humble scholars. But tonight, we look past that polished image to explore what life inside these religious sanctuaries was truly like, and why the shadows they cast stretched far beyond their stone walls. The medieval church was far more than a place of worship. It was the most powerful institution in Europe, with influence that reached into every corner of life. It owned vast lands, swayed kings, and held the authority to decide matters of life and death. Within this spiritual empire, monastic orders operated like elite inner circles, bound by sacred vows, but often compromised by very human desires. Tonight, we'll walk the cloisters where personal ambition wore the mask of holiness, where spiritual promises were used to excuse cruelty, and where the quest for purity sometimes led to deeply troubling acts. We'll meet abbots who ruled like nobles, monks who forsook charity for comfort, and entire orders that served not salvation but control. But first, we must understand the world that birthed these orders. Medieval Europe was a land marked by instability, plague, famine, and violence-shaped daily life. For many, the hope of heaven was the only refuge from a world filled with suffering and uncertainty. Into this landscape stepped the church, not just with prayer, but with real power over what people feared most. From that fear, the religious orders arose. Some, like the Benedictines, drew inspiration from early Christian hermits who fled worldly temptation. Others, like the Franciscans and Dominicans, emerged later, responding to the chaos of the age with promises of renewal and simplicity. But as their influence grew, so too did their entanglement with the power structures they once stood apart. From the Cistercians, for example, began with a mission of reform and rural labor. They sought to live humbly, clearing forests and working the land by hand. But within generations, their monasteries turned into wealthy estates operated by lay brothers who endured harsh, often exploitative conditions. The white-robed monks who once preached simplicity now enjoyed fine meals, while those beneath them struggled. Or take the Knights Templar warrior monks, who took vows of humility and chastity while building a financial empire across Europe. Their rise in wealth and influence made them targets of both kings and popes. Their downfall would expose a tangled web of secrecy and politics that shook the foundations of medieval power. The monastic life, idealized as one of quiet devotion, often became a stage for deeper conflicts. Nobles sometimes forced their younger sons and daughters into religious life, seizing their inheritance and silencing their ambitions. These unwilling monks and nuns brought their resentment with them, turning sacred spaces into centers of tension, power struggles, and control. Behind monastery walls, rigid hierarchies formed, mirroring the harshest structures of secular life. Novices endured harsh initiations framed as spiritual training. Those who challenged authority faced humiliation, isolation, or worse, the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Once symbols of freedom from worldly distraction became tools used to trap individuals in roles they had never chosen. The scholarly work of monasteries, often praised, also came with a darker reality. Knowledge was tightly guarded and only shared with those who accepted church authority without question. Books that challenged approved teachings were destroyed, and thinkers who questioned the status quo were silenced. Rather than places of learning, many monasteries became fortresses of ideology, preserving only what reinforced their own power. Even acts of charity, so often celebrated, sometimes served more as public spectacle than real compassion. The sick, in monastic hospitals, received care shaped more by tradition than medicine. The poor were given just enough to remain dependent, often scolded for their misfortune. Orphans taken in were expected to labor in return, their childhoods exchanged for the upkeep of the very institutions meant to protect them. The spiritual life at the heart of monastic orders was not immune either. Rituals meant to elevate the soul became rote performances, disconnected from true belief. The texts monks copied were selectively edited, passages that conflicted with church aims were removed or rewritten. What was once sacred became a means of control. Perhaps most disturbing of all was how these institutions redefined the idea of divine justice, claimed to act in love while carrying out cruelty. Trials and punishments were framed as moral necessity, and suffering was explained away as purification. The Inquisition, run in large part by Dominican friars, used force to extract admissions of guilt, insisting their actions saved souls from eternal peril. The wealth amassed by monasteries eventually became a scandal in itself. While they preached poverty, their leaders lived in comfort that rivaled royalty. Monastic treasuries overflowed with gifts from the devout, yet surrounding villages remained poor and neglected. This disconnect between preaching and practice sparked unrest, paving the way for future reforms, including the Protestant Reformation. As we step further into this shadowed world, we'll uncover stories that complicate everything we thought we knew about medieval spiritual life. We'll meet individuals who stood against corruption, often paying dearly for their courage. We'll explore how ordinary people became caught in systems that rewarded silence and punished truth, and we'll see how the desire for purity, when wielded without accountability, has often led to outcomes far removed from compassion. The religious orders of the Middle Ages were not simply groups of devout believers, they were human institutions, influenced by ambition, fear, greed, and the need for power. To truly understand them, we must look beyond their holy image and confront the deeper truths they conceal. Tonight, we pass through gates that do not lead to paradise, but into a world where spiritual leadership masked worldly dominance, where the hope of salvation came at the expense of basic human dignity, and where institutions built on ideals became mechanisms of profound exploitation. The darkness we're about to explore isn't just a matter of historical curiosity. It's a mirror reflecting how noble intentions can be reshaped by unchecked power, especially when that power claims divine authority. As we step into this shadowed world, remember, the men and women we'll encounter were shaped by their era, molded by beliefs and conditions difficult for us to fully imagine. Yet their stories still resonate because they illuminate patterns in human behavior that echo across time. The potential for both compassion and cruelty exists in every generation. And the religious communities of medieval Europe reveal just how thin the boundary between the two can become. So let's begin our exploration of these once revered sanctuaries, places where the sacred and worldly became entangled in ways that would surprise even the most devout believers. Part: the corruption of sacred vows. Behind the towering walls of medieval abbeys and cloisters, a darker reality stirred beneath the surface of reverent routine. These places, designed as refuges of prayer and self-denial, too often became spaces where ideals gave way to ambition, and spiritual discipline was distorted by human flaws. At the heart of monastic life were three solemn vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. But in practice, these commitments were frequently twisted, redefined not by spiritual insight, but by personal and institutional gain. It's a bitter irony. Those who pledged to turn away from worldly excess often embraced it more fervently than the nobility they were meant to rise above. Take the vow of poverty, for instance. While everyday laborers struggled to feed their families, Many monastic leaders lived in wealth that rivaled royalty. Lavish meals, imported luxuries, and well-guarded treasuries became the norm behind monastery walls. Some abbeys, like those at Cluny and St. Denis, became renowned not just for their piety, but for their gold jewels, priceless relics accumulated through heavy tithes, estate holdings, and the donations of believers hoping to secure favor in the next life. Some abbots even commanded armed forces, not for defense, but for influence, launching campaigns over disputed lands in the name of religious authority. But driven by worldly ambition, the Abbey of Saint-Tropez in France, for example, gained notoriety for its military ventures cloaked in theological justification. Though motivated largely by wealth and control, the vow of chastity, too, was subject to erosion. While the public image was one of solemn celibacy, the reality behind some convent and monastery doors was far more complicated. Reports circulated of inappropriate behavior, secret relationships, and moral compromise. In some areas, disturbing patterns of misconduct were alleged to have been protected by silence and isolation. A number of accounts describe novices, young men and women, often placed in religious life by family decision rather than personal choice, facing coercion rather than compassion. In remote monastic environments, where oversight was scarce and authority nearly absolute, some individuals found themselves vulnerable. Few options for redress. Obedience, the third vow, became perhaps the most potent tool of control. Intended to foster humility and discipline, it was sometimes used instead to demand unquestioning submission. Monastic superiors exercised sweeping authority, and dissent was often met with harsh consequences. Those who raised concerns, whether about misconduct, mismanagement, or moral failings, expulsion, or worse. In many communities, silence wasn't just a virtue, it was a survival strategy. Perhaps the most disheartening distortion was how some institutions came to treat salvation itself as a transaction. Offerings and payments were increasingly tied to promises of spiritual relief. Indulgence, originally meant to reflect inner repentance, began to be sold with the assurance of reduced suffering in the hereafter. Wealth became a pathway to a divine favor, while the poor, lacking resources, were left to navigate their fears with little comfort. This monetization of spiritual hope marked a deep departure from early Christian ideals and led to growing resentment and eventual calls for reform. The intellectual impact of monastic control was no less severe. Monasteries held the keys to most written knowledge in the medieval world, but this knowledge was often tightly restricted. Writings that contradicted church orthodoxy were destroyed or hidden. Some libraries became exclusive vaults, where access was limited to those deemed ideologically safe. Books on science, philosophy, and history that might have challenged prevailing views disappeared, and their loss has left enduring gaps in our cultural heritage. This narrowing of intellectual life wasn't accidental, it was strategic. It kept the population dependent on clerical interpretation, and it ensured that alternative perspectives remained beyond reach. Literacy itself was discouraged among the general populace. The fewer who could read scripture or question doctrine, the more control the church retained over daily life. By shaping what people could think, say, and believe, certain institutions entrenched their authority far beyond the altar, and in doing so, they slowed the very progress that might have lifted communities out of ignorance and fear. Economically, these religious orders commanded extraordinary power. Many became among the largest landholders in Europe, owning vast tracts of farmland and forests. These lands, often exempt from taxation, gave monastic institutions a privileged position over secular estates. But the labor that maintained them was commonly unpaid, drawn from peasants who lived in conditions that allowed little freedom or recourse. This system not only drained local economies, it also reinforced a deeply unequal society. While the church spoke of compassion, much of its wealth was locked away in treasure rooms or spent on grand building projects, inaccessible to the very people who sustained it. Meanwhile, those in need, whether sick, orphaned, or poor, frequently found themselves overlooked, unless they could offer something in return. Prayers, blessings, and funerals often came with price tags. Acts of charity were sometimes conditional, transactional, or used to build reputation rather than to meet genuine need. Individuals who sought comfort in their most desperate moments could be turned away, unless they met the spiritual and financial expectations of those in power. The emotional toll of this betrayal was profound. Communities that placed deep trust in religious leadership found themselves disillusioned. When sacred institutions failed to embody the values they preached, the result was not just personal disappointment, it was a collapse of collective confidence. Over time, this growing cynicism helped pave the way for wider transformations in European religious life. For many, the realization that even sacred vows could be manipulated became a call not just for reform, but for fundamental change. Some voices did rise in resistance, calling for renewal, honesty, and a return to principle. But those who spoke too loudly often faced harsh retaliation. In many cases, the strongest defenders of conscience became the first targets of suppression. While entrenched systems remained unshaken at least for a time, the efforts of reformers like Bernard of Clairvaux aimed to bring monastic life back to its original purpose: humility, service, and reflection. But those movements were often absorbed into the very structures they tried to change, or quietly suppressed by those who benefited from the established order. Individuals of sincere faith who remained inside the religious houses often found themselves isolated, unable to push back against deeply rooted dysfunction. Even the way monasteries recruited new members revealed troubling realities. Now, instead of seeking those with a genuine spiritual calling, many religious houses became places where families sent members who were seen as difficult to place in society. Children with disabilities, daughters deemed unlikely to marry, and sons considered rebellious were often placed in monasteries, their families paying sizable sums for the arrangement. These involuntary members, cut off from their previous lives, frequently struggled to find meaning in their roles. Some became disillusioned and disengaged, while others contributed to the very cycles of dysfunction that shaped their institutions. Inside many monasteries, an internal legal system operated separately from secular law. Superiors had broad authority over those in their care, with little to no outside oversight. This created pockets of power where abuses could occur behind closed doors, unseen and unchallenged. Reports from the time spoke of hidden holding cells, suspicious disappearances, and forms of punishment that echoed the harshest measures of the age, even by medieval standards. The conduct within some of these religious communities shocked the conscience of outside observers. Perhaps the most long-lasting consequence of this pattern was the impact it had on public trust in religious life. When those entrusted with moral guidance strayed so visibly from their ideals, it raised serious doubts among the faithful. For many, the hypocrisy they witnessed made it impossible to continue placing their trust in religious institutions. The seeds of the Protestant Reformation and the eventual shift towards secular governance were in many ways planted in this soil of disillusionment. The broad reach of these religious orders also made reform difficult. Their international structure allowed resources and influence to move across borders, creating networks of power that could resist local scrutiny. As this reach grew, practices once confined to one location began to spread, leading to widespread and deeply ingrained patterns of control and exploitation. As we reflect on this complex and sobering chapter in human history, we must see it not simply as a relic of the past, but as a powerful lesson. When institutions claim moral authority but operate without accountability, the consequences can be devastating. The harm inflicted especially on the most vulnerable stands as a warning about how ideals can be distorted by unchecked power. For the common people of the time, there was little chance to speak out. Their lives were shaped by systems they couldn't challenge and promises that were rarely kept. The messages they heard spoke of love and salvation, but the reality they experienced was one of hardship, silence, and service to institutions that often seemed more interested in wealth than wisdom. These contradictions are at the heart of the monastic legacy, And while earlier episodes explore the structural corruption of monastic institutions, we've only begun to examine how deeply the damage ran. The same institutions that offered hope and sanctuary were also the source of practices that would darken countless lives. Consider the system of oblation, in which young children, some as young as 7, were placed into monasteries by families who could not or would not care for them. These children, called oblates, had no say in their fate. Many lived lives of hardship, often treated more as servants than students. Accounts from the period describe harsh physical discipline and cold, punishing routines, and some abbeys' boys were made to sleep on bare floors, perform hours of manual labor, and endure strict penalties for minor missteps. These harsh treatments were rationalized as discipline or training for spiritual strength, yet they often crossed into something more destructive. In isolated environments with rigid hierarchies, young oblates were especially vulnerable to mistreatment. Trusted superiors held overwhelming authority, and complaints when made were rarely taken seriously. Church records, where they exist, sometimes reveal disturbing patterns of inaction, in which troubling behavior was minimized, denied, or simply moved out of public view. Even prominent monasteries were not immune. Despite reputations for piety and reform, some of these institutions harbored deep and unresolved issues. The well-known Abbey of Cluny, a symbol of monastic renewal, was later associated with reports of serious misconduct. Leaders there, despite public reputations for holiness, oversaw a culture of fear and silence that discouraged reporting and accountability. When concerns were raised, those who spoke out were often relocated to remote houses, effectively silenced without ever addressing the root problem. The emotional and mental toll of life in such settings was profound. Within some monasteries, systems of psychological pressure were developed to maintain order. Extended periods of silence, restricted communication, and carefully monitored routines created atmospheres of quiet control. Monks in certain houses were not permitted to speak freely outside of designated hours. Even a glance or informal conversation could be considered defiance. Those suspected of holding dissenting thoughts might be placed in isolation for weeks, emerging subdued, changed, or entirely broken in spirit. The economic structures of these institutions also played a major role in the suffering of many. While abbots dined in splendor and stored away treasures donated by the faithful, ordinary monks and laborers worked long hours with little rest. Their labor was the engine that built the wealth of the church, yet they saw little of its benefit. At the Cistercian headquarters in Quito, this contrast was especially evident. Vast tracts of land were cultivated by lay workers who toiled for long hours with minimal sustenance. Promised spiritual reward, they gave everything in return. Received poor treatment, chronic exhaustion, and early graves. These individuals, mostly anonymous today, were the foundation of the wealth that supported vast architectural projects, elaborate rituals, and powerful alliances. Even the intellectual contributions of monasteries must be seen through a nuanced lens. While monastic scribes preserved many valuable texts, they also destroyed or censored ideas that challenged prevailing doctrine. Works of ancient philosophy, science, and alternative theology were deemed dangerous and systematically removed. From libraries, at Monte Cassino, a center of learning and discipline, numerous classical writings were reportedly removed or redacted to ensure alignment with Christian teaching. In some cases, monks actively rewrote historical narratives to support institutional interests, changing or omitting inconvenient facts that might disrupt the official story. Religious chroniclers of the medieval era often shaped history to fit the image the church wished to present. Instead of preserving balanced accounts, many works glorified church leaders and demonized their opponents, building a narrative that painted the institution as humanity's savior while concealing its role in systems of control and exploitation. Some accounts were based on forged documents that justified land ownership or invented signs and events intended to inspire fear or draw in donations. Even sacred texts were occasionally revised not to reflect truth, but to preserve influence. Medical practices within many monasteries were deeply flawed, and sometimes caused far more harm than healing. Lacking scientific understanding and driven more by theory than evidence, some monks who oversaw infirmaries performed experimental treatments on vulnerable patients. Under the belief that physical pain could lead to spiritual purification, certain procedures became alarmingly harsh. At St. Bartholomew's in London, treatments included crude surgeries performed without pain relief or proper sanitation. Patients were bled excessively, wounds were sealed with heated metal. Toxic substances like mercury were administered under the assumption they would rebalance the body's humors. These treatments, though framed as divinely inspired, often inflicted lasting damage or death. Women associated with or placed within religious institutions faced an especially complex and difficult reality. While convents were presented as places of sanctuary, some became sites of systemic mistreatment. In certain regions, visiting clergy were granted unchecked access to these convents under the pretense of spiritual oversight. This often led to deeply inappropriate power dynamics. Some women were forced into roles far removed from religious life, used by their superiors to raise funds or settle debts. Others were confined to convents against their will, placed there by families looking to avoid paying dowries or manage scandal. The convent of San Pietro Damiani in Italy became infamous for receiving young women whose families had essentially traded them into permanent religious life. Upon entry, these women were required to give up any inheritance rights and live under strict and often harsh conditions. The goal was obedience, and many were subjected to routines designed to suppress any personal identity or resistance. Female religious houses sometimes also became the final stop for women society had failed. Survivors of assault, or those whose reputations were tarnished by circumstances beyond their control, were placed in religious custody and labeled as penitents. These women were punished not for crimes they committed, but for societal shame they had been made to carry. They endured austere routines, wearing coarse garments, sleeping on hard surfaces, and eating only the bare minimum. Meanwhile, the individuals responsible for their suffering often faced no consequence at all. Beyond these personal stories, the broader social impact of the monastic system was equally troubling. While these institutions claimed to care for the poor, they frequently reinforced the very structures that kept populations in poverty. Monasteries allied themselves with local aristocracy, helping suppress uprisings and maintain feudal systems. They justified bonded labor as a divine order, and used sermons to encourage compliance. True social reform was often actively resisted by the same institutions that claimed to serve the public good. One such example was the monastery at Vézelay in France, which became a symbol of religious alignment with political power. The monks there worked closely with the ruling class, labeling discontented peasants as heretics, and calling for armed force to restore what they called order. When villagers asked for fairer treatment, they were met not with compassion, but condemnation. The resulting violence led to widespread devastation, hundreds of lives lost, and entire communities reduced to hardship. Perhaps the most lasting damage was done not to bodies, but to belief itself. The commodification of faith, turning it into something that could be bought or sold, eroded the very idea of spirituality. Religious ceremonies became transactional. Sacred milestones such as baptisms, weddings, and funerals came with required fees. The concept of indulgence as monetary payments said to reduce punishment in the afterlife turned personal salvation into a matter of wealth. The Abbey of Cluny became a pioneer in refining these systems. Elaborate donation structures were created. To accompany every stage of life, those who could pay received blessings and services. Those who could not were often turned away or indebted. In some cases, these debts became burdens passed from one generation to the next. What made these systems so effective was the way they tapped into fundamental human fears. Monks and preachers developed highly detailed doctrines about the afterlife, describing suffering beyond death in vivid and terrifying terms. The message was clear: without financial support for the church, one's soul and the souls of loved ones might never find peace. Grieving families were especially vulnerable, often persuaded that only donations could guarantee safe passage for the departed. These ideas spread widely, embedding themselves in the cultural consciousness and becoming nearly impossible to question. The resulting atmosphere was one of fear and suppression. Intellectual exploration withered under the weight of dogma. Those who asked questions were suspected of disloyalty. Books outside the approved canon were banned or destroyed. The very institutions that had once copied and preserved texts now decided which truths were safe to keep. Science, philosophy, and independent moral thought were constrained. Leaving societies intellectually stagnant, the fear extended beyond the pulpit. Ordinary people lived under constant anxiety, worried about sin, penance, damnation, and the potential wrath of spiritual leaders. Doubt became dangerous, and those who dared to think independently faced excommunication, public shaming, or worse. In time, this cultural climate stifled innovation, creativity, and reform. For centuries, millions of people lived within systems that discouraged any kind of personal awakening or dissent. As we trace these patterns through time, one fact becomes painfully clear. Institutions that present themselves as moral authorities must never be beyond scrutiny. The religious orders of medieval Europe were not monolithic. They're complex networks shaped by individuals and culture. But the structures they created, when left unchecked, gave rise to some of history's most persistent abuses of power. The pain they inflicted wasn't always visible. It lived in the fear of a grieving widow told she hadn't paid enough to save her husband's soul, in the silence of a child whose questions were met with threats, the endless labor of peasants told their suffering was holy, and in the young monks and nuns whose daily lives bore little resemblance to the ideals they had once been promised. While many religious leaders no doubt acted with sincerity and compassion, the systems they were part of too often rewarded greed, secrecy, and control. This legacy still resonates. It teaches us that institutions, even those claiming to act in the name of the divine, must be transparent, accountable, and humble. The story of the medieval monastery is not just one of stone, walls, and candlelit halls. It is the story of human beings, some striving to live in grace, others wielding sacred words for worldly gain, and of entire generations caught in the middle, seeking hope, but often finding only hardship. As we confront these difficult truths, we do so not to condemn spirituality, but to honor the countless voices lost in silence. The peasants, the orphans, the oblates, the dismissed, and the disappeared. Their stories, hidden for centuries beneath cloisters and script, deserve to be told with clarity, care, and unflinching honesty. Only then can we learn from the shadows they left behind. Power often cloaks itself in righteousness, and nowhere was that clearer than in the religious institutions of medieval Europe. Despite their outward mission to serve both God and the common good, many religious orders became centers of immense influence, operating unchecked, and often prioritizing material gain over spiritual responsibility. These institutions, shrouded in solemn vows and elaborate ceremony, frequently became vehicles for exploitation, raising troubling questions about the nature of authority and the capacity for self-deception when virtue is used as a shield. The historical record is stark. Religious orders of the time, while espousing humility and self-sacrifice, often accumulated great wealth and lived in striking contrast to the values they proclaimed. The very monasteries that rang with chants of devotion were, in reality, enmeshed in the systems of power and privilege they claimed to transcend. Let us begin with a moment that captures the hypocrisy hidden behind sacred walls. As the morning bells echoed across the frosted fields surrounding Cluny Abbey in the year 1275, Brother Thomas descended into the lower vaults to check on the winter stores. What he found would remain with him forever: barrels of rare wine from far-off regions, imported fabrics hidden beneath burlap, and coffers overflowing with minted gold from royal courts and merchant guilds. It was not the humble simplicity of Christ's example, or the austere vision of Saint Benedict. It was opulence concealed beneath vows of poverty. Monasteries and convents were meant to be sanctuaries of learning, prayer, and service. Instead, many became power centers as grand and politically entangled as any noble estate. The very institutions that championed spiritual purity often mirrored the secular world's corruption and, in some cases, surpassed it. Luxurious feasts, private quarters that resembled palaces, and hierarchies driven by bloodline or political allegiance were not anomalies, they were the norm. At the top of these structures were abbots and abbesses, often appointed not for their spiritual merits but for their lineage or their ability to secure patronage. Wealthy families saw these roles as extensions of their influence. The Abbey of Saint-Denis near Paris, once revered for its sacred relics, became known for leaders who lived extravagantly, throwing grand feasts and commissioning lavish structures. Abbot Suzaire, who helped shape Gothic architecture, justified these excesses as spiritual upliftment, but others whispered that he simply wished to rival kings in grandeur. His successor, Albert of Duel, carried this trend even further, maintaining a private collection of rare animals and ordering costly, illuminated manuscripts that served more as displays of status than tools of devotion. The resources for such luxuries came from sources that, even at the time, were questioned for their ethical implications. Monasteries controlled large estates worked by local populations, owed labor and goods to their religious landlords. In some areas, these institutions were more demanding than secular lords, levying higher rents, forcing stricter penalties, and offering little support in return. At Bury St. Edmunds, complaints circulated that monks imposed harsh duties on local villagers, while enjoying refined meals and imported comforts within their stone walls. Simony, the selling of religious positions, was also widespread. Entire abbeys passed from uncle to nephew, as though they were inherited estates. In places like Farfa in Italy, monastic leadership was passed along noble bloodlines, with little concern for the spiritual readiness of the successor. The practice of selling indulgences, spiritual pardons in exchange for financial offerings, became so normalized that traveling friars were often mistaken for merchants. While intended to fund religious projects, the system quickly became a tool for exploiting the fears of the faithful. Promising eternal rewards to those who could pay, vows too were often reduced to performance. Chastity, in particular, was treated more as an ideal than a lived reality. Some bishops, recognizing the widespread nature of certain infractions, imposed fines rather than spiritual disciplining, forming vows into taxable offenses. Even the most prominent institutions were affected. At its peak, Cluny Abbey oversaw hundreds of religious houses, yet struggled to maintain consistent discipline across them. Reports circulated of monks living in close company with women, with children born into arrangements that were discreetly explained away. St. Gall Abbey in Switzerland was forced to expel members over persistent misconduct. Monte Cassino, the symbolic heart of Western monasticism, faced repeated crises that challenged its legacy. Female religious communities faced unique pressures. While presented as places of refuge and devotion, many convents were filled with women who had not chosen the path freely. Daughters considered unlikely to marry, or viewed as liabilities, were often placed into religious life by family arrangement. Some adapted sincerely. Others, understandably, struggled with the constraints imposed upon them. One convent in Milan, later investigated by the Church, had become deeply entangled in a system where money, influence, and misconduct blurred dangerously. Internal inquiries uncovered a culture shaped by bribery and control, far removed from the ideals the institution claimed to uphold. The educational contributions of monasteries, often celebrated by historians, were not immune to decline. Earlier centuries, these institutions had preserved knowledge during times of instability. But by the High Middle Ages, many scriptoria had fallen silent. Copying manuscripts became less attractive compared to the growing wealth found in land, leasing, trade, or political alliances. Even worse, some institutions actively limited intellectual progress. New ideas that challenged church interpretations were suppressed. Roger Bacon, an early advocate of empirical research, was placed under restriction by his own order for proposing scientific methodologies. Elsewhere, philosophical texts were destroyed for presenting ideas deemed incompatible with religious teaching. At the monastery of San Lorenzo in Florence, works of ancient science and literature were discarded. The Abbey of Reichenau allegedly sold ancient manuscripts as scrap, material parchment reused rather than preserved. Worship itself also changed. Monastic prayers, once seen as moments of sacred focus, became rapid recitations. Some monks hired others to fulfill their obligations, prioritizing personal affairs over spiritual duties. The divine office, once a unifying structure of daily life, turned into a burden to be rushed through, its meaning diluted by repetition and neglect. Even acts of charity, once central to Christian life, were sometimes repurposed for public image or gain. Hospitals run by monasteries did provide care, but some also engaged in questionable practices behind closed doors. A hospital in Rome was accused of treating remains in ways that benefited outside interests. In London, an almshouse was found to be diverting food meant for the needy into private kitchens. These revelations were not only shocking, they were devastating to communities that had placed their trust in the spiritual mission of the church. The architecture itself told a story. While the rules of monastic life encouraged modesty, many abbey churches became monuments to grandeur. The reconstruction of Canterbury Cathedral, following the death of Thomas Becket, cost vast sums of resources that critics noted could have helped countless families in need. Monks defended such projects as offerings to the divine, but others saw them as reflections of worldly pride. Religious houses became economic powerhouses, controlling large regions, influencing local economies, and negotiating directly with kings. Some monasteries fielded private guards or entered into land disputes with neighboring nobles. Cluny and Quito, both pillars of monastic tradition, fought over territories, income, and influence. Despite professing allegiance to the same spiritual ideals in time, these power struggles led to military-style religious orders like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. Founded to protect travelers and provide aid during the Crusades, they evolved into vast multinational networks with financial and political power rivaling that of monarchies. The Templars, in particular, became so wealthy and autonomous that their secrecy aroused suspicion and eventually led to their dissolution in a blaze of controversy. And yet, even in the midst of all this, it's important to remember that not all within the system were complicit. There were monks and nuns who lived with integrity, who cared for the sick, taught the young, held fast to their faith amid surrounding corruption. There were reformers who tried to change the course of monastic life, though they were often silenced or co-opted. Their stories, though quieter, are no less important, but the overall system, when viewed through the lens of history, remains a cautionary tale. Institutions that claim moral authority must be held to the highest standards, not the lowest. The failures of the medieval monastic world remind us that sacred language and noble intentions can be twisted to justify control, indulgence, and silence. And that any institution, no matter how revered, must answer not only to tradition, but to truth. As we walk away from this part of history, we carry with us the responsibility of remembering both the light and the shadow. Not to condemn faith, but to guard it. Not to erase belief, but to ensure that belief is never used as a mask for power. The cloisters of medieval Europe may now lie in ruin, but the lessons they offer are still vital, still urgent, and still echoing in the chambers of history. An envy more dangerous than any sword ultimately led to the downfall of the Knights Templar. King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the order and threatened by their growing power, moved decisively. Under the guise of heresy, he dismantled the institution, seizing its wealth and extinguishing its influence. But the real story was far more complex. Their fate was not just a result of royal ambition, it reflected the larger truth that the very structure of religious orders in medieval Europe made them vulnerable to corruption. The problem was never limited to individuals who failed to live up to their vows. It was systemic, embedded in the foundations of medieval society. Once monasteries became landowners, political actors, and economic powerhouses, their spiritual focus was inevitably compromised. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience meant to elevate the soul were too often treated as ceremonial gestures rather than guiding principles. Still, not all hope was lost. Not every abbey succumbed to the lure of wealth or influence. Throughout history, there were always those who resisted, who called their communities back to humility and service. The Cistercian movement of the 12th century, born in response to excess, sought to recover the simplicity of early monastic life. Figures like Bernard of Clairvaux preached passionately against the moral decay of their era, but they were fighting a tide too strong, a current fueled by centuries of unchecked power. Even as bells rang out across the land, summoning monks to prayer, one could not help but wonder how many were truly seeking God and how many were simply performing rituals in a system that had lost its soul. The shadows cast by medieval monasteries were not fleeting. They stretched from the cellars of Cluny to the tall towers of Templar fortresses. From convents entangled in secular life to the quiet scriptoria where ideas were once meant to be preserved, not edited for convenience. These were places built for divine reflection, but they became mirrors of human weakness. Institutions that had once promised transformation often delivered compromise. What unfolded in these cloisters was not just a departure from values. It was a slow erosion of purpose, surrender of spiritual ideals to the pull of material gain. In their rise and decline, we see the universal human struggle between the sacred and the worldly, between intention and ambition, and the echoes of those choices still reach us. The legacy of monastic corruption reminds us that no system, however holy it may seem, is immune to the temptation of unchecked influence. Even sacred institutions can forget their origins. Picture for a moment Brother Thomas wandering again through the cold stone corridors of his abbey, holding within him the knowledge of all he had seen, the treasures hidden where none should be, the silence surrounding truths no one dared name. His world had changed, not through rebellion or fire, but through realization. And that may be the most haunting transformation of all. As night spread across medieval Europe, and fires dwindled in village hearths, the faithful turned once more to the only institutions they knew, the monasteries and convents, the towering churches and chanting choirs. These were to be sanctuaries of peace, homes for contemplation, places where divine light was to shine through earthly darkness. But within those sacred walls, another reality unfolded. Behind the hymns and gilded altars was a world shaped not only by devotion, but by influence, desire, and fear. While the poor labored in fields and the sick prayed for mercy, religious institutions grew in power. Their walls stood tall, but their foundations trembled under the weight of contradictions. For the peasants bound by duty and hardship, there were no illusions. While they endured lives of hunger and uncertainty, the religious houses above them, those who preached renunciation, were building empires of land, wealth, and authority. And the chains these institutions forged were not made of iron, but of privilege, secrecy, and promise. These were not minor failings, they were institutional betrayals. Where sacred vows called for simplicity, greed found a foothold. Where the rule demanded celibacy, discretion took its place. And where humility was meant to reign, influence became the language of power. In the abbeys and priories of Christendom, a new trinity arose, not one of faith, hope, and charity, but of wealth, ambition, and control. The clergy who urged restraint and service often lived lives that would have astonished kings. Those who counseled abstinence found ways around their own teachings. And those who urged generosity turned away from the very people their faith instructed them to uplift. Even more troubling was how spiritual authority became a tool of coercion, an age where salvation was not just a belief but a necessity. The power to absolve or condemn was immense. This sacred responsibility, once wielded with reverence, was in some places reduced to transaction. The confessional became currency. The pulpit, a platform for persuasion. Inside the scriptoria, the heart of monastic learning, intentions, too, began to shift. Where once monks copied scripture to preserve divine wisdom, they began to document donations, legacies, and contracts. Books once rich with theological insight gave way to ledgers. Collections of ancient texts were not shared, they were hidden, altered, or in some cases, quietly destroyed to maintain doctrinal control. Monasteries became administrative hub centers, not just of worship, but of record-keeping and wealth management. Salvation was no longer just a path, it was a commodity. Priced and weighed, exchanged for gold or loyalty. Consider the rise of Cluny Abbey, once founded on the ideal of purity and reform. Over time, it grew into a monastic empire, overseeing hundreds of dependent houses. Its leaders lived in astonishing luxury, while peasants gave up their harvests in exchange for prayers for their dead. Its churches gleamed with treasures, gifts from the desperate, who believed they were purchasing peace in the next life. Yet even that grandeur tells only part of the story. Behind the public rituals were private habits. Monks maintained personal arrangements in nearby villages, while certain convents saw the emergence of internal cultures shaped more by pragmatism than faith. The vow of chastity became a concept subject to negotiation, and its breach, so long as it was discreet, was rarely pursued with seriousness. These houses of faith became centers of strategy. Abbots aligned with nobles. Abbesses negotiated with regional powers. Some monasteries even influenced papal elections, their networks spanning borders and generations. Worst of all, the most vulnerable were often left unprotected. Children placed into monasteries for education or protection were sometimes exposed to conditions far from nurturing. These oblates, bound to religious life before they could understand it, were frequently subjected to rigid discipline, and in some places, to conditions that betrayed the very idea of Christian care. The monastic system developed hierarchies where silence reigned and questioning was discouraged. Those in authority answered only to higher ranks within the church. External oversight was rare. This closed system made justice difficult and reform. Harder still, it would be unfair to paint every monk or nun with the same brush. Many lived quiet lives of service, scholarship, and sincere faith. Many resisted the tide, even when it cost them dearly. But the larger system, powerful, secretive, and self-sustaining, enabled contradictions that grew into crisis by the late Middle Ages. The cracks were no longer hidden. Reformers spoke louder. Common people began to question what had once seemed unquestionable. And with time, these questions would lead to transformation, to schisms, to reformation, to new movements, seeking again the heart of the gospel. The story of medieval monasticism is a story of ideals challenged by reality, of human aspiration undermined by human nature. It is a story we must tell, not to condemn belief, but to guard it from corruption. For the weight of those shadows, the ones cast by stone, cloisters and gilded altars, still lingers. They remind us that holiness is not guaranteed by office, and that no institution, no matter how sacred its origin, is immune to the failings of those who build it. As you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps you'll think of Brother Thomas, still wandering those long halls in his memory, carrying with him not just the truths he uncovered, but the silence that surrounded them, and perhaps, in remembering him, we remember the cost of silence and the power of truth. Served not as spiritual apprentices, but as unpaid laborers, ensuring the comfort of their superiors, the abbots and priors, entrusted to model lives of humble service, often acted instead as feudal lords, demanding absolute obedience while answering to no earthly authority. They spoke as though their words carried divine weight, and in a world where contradiction invited peril, few dared to question them. This was not a matter of a few wayward houses. It was systemic, woven into the very structure of medieval religious life. The corruption did not stop at the monastery gate. It extended through every tier of the church, from village priests to powerful cardinals. Abuse was tolerated, grievances silenced, sacred roles exchanged for wealth in plain view. The sale of ecclesiastical offices, known as simony, had become so common that it no longer shocked. Even more audacious was the sale of indulgences, certificates that claimed to reduce spiritual penalties in the afterlife. These were sold door to door, marketed with the authority of Rome. The desperate were promised that for the right donation, sins could be washed away and lost loved ones granted peace. Families emptied their savings in hope, unaware that the mercy they believed they had bought was part of a vast economy of spiritual commerce. But the manipulation didn't stop there. Monastic communities, eager to draw pilgrims and offerings, began producing relics of questionable origin. declared to be from saints, splinters said to be from the true cross, and scraps of fabric promoted as having miraculous contact with sacred figures. Pilgrims journeyed for weeks, sometimes months, to venerate what they believed were holy artifacts, leaving behind offerings that lined the coffers of the abbey. What had once been a sacred mission to preserve knowledge and provide education also fell under the weight of worldly concerns. Rather than share wisdom freely, monasteries hoarded it, maintaining their grip on power through control of literacy and learning. Only texts that reinforced ecclesiastical authority were preserved. Dissenting ideas were silenced, their writings destroyed, their names erased. Even acts of charity, once the proud heart of Christian monasticism, became transactional. The poor were fed, the sick were tended, but always with conditions attached. Aid was distributed in exchange for submission, praise, or silence.
Wow.
Those who questioned treatment or resisted the expected deference found themselves denied help entirely. Mercy, once unconditional, became a tool of reinforcement, and the buildings themselves, their very stones, testified to the shift. The simple chapels of early monks gave way to towering cathedrals and sprawling cloisters. These were no longer shelters of spiritual retreat, they were monuments to ambition. Wealth extracted from the faithful was poured into walls that reached not in humility, but in competition. Each abbey tried to outshine the next. Inside those halls, where monks and nuns were meant to engage in mutual correction and support, silence had been weaponized. Questioning the status quo brought swift punishment. Those who spoke out against the growing excesses of their communities were accused of disobedience or worse, heresy. Trials followed, not in search of truth, but in defense of power. Those convicted faced expulsion or isolation. The very people who were supposed to be spiritual family became instruments of fear. Guest houses meant for hospitality became listening posts. Travelers and pilgrims, thinking they had found sanctuary, were quietly observed. Their loyalties measured, their affiliations reported. Information gathered under the guise of welcome was sold or leveraged in pursuit of greater influence. Even the ancient right of sanctuary, once a sacred promise of protection, was increasingly compromised. Some communities bent to political pressures, allowing refuge seekers to be seized. Others used the presence of fugitives as bargaining chips in their dealings with secular lords. Allegiance to power, not God, dictated outcomes. But perhaps the most tragic failure of all was spiritual. The rhythm of prayer that once filled cloisters with meaning had, in many places, become a rote performance. Words were chanted without thought, rituals completed out of obligation, not reverence. The deep inner life that monasticism was built to cultivate, contemplation, humility, communion with the divine, was replaced by scheduling concerns, business, arrangements, and strategic planning. These were no longer sanctuaries of the soul. They were enterprises, and the currency was influence. Even the mass sacred center of Christian life was affected. Wealthy patrons could pay for masses to be said in their names, or for their deceased. Monks, under pressure to fulfill these contracts, sometimes conducted dozens in a day, racing through ceremonies with little reflection. What was once a holy act became a production line. The confessional to once a place of healing was corrupted. Sensitive confessions from the powerful were remembered, not to offer better guidance, but for political advantage. Information whispered in trust was not always held in silence. In some cases, it became a source of leverage. The sacred boundary between priest and penitent was blurred by ambition. Libraries, those great treasures of learning, were not immune. Ancient medical texts that could have improved lives were locked away. Scientific treatises that questioned orthodoxy were hidden or destroyed. Historical records that might have exposed contradictions were edited or concealed. The monasteries, once guardians of light, became gatekeepers of shadows, and even death, that great equalizer, became stratified. The rich were granted ornate funerals, gilded tombs, and promises of eternal prayer so long as generous gifts were made to the religious house. The poor, meanwhile, were given hurried rites and simple burials. The church taught that all souls were equal before God, but the lived reality told a different story. One measured in coin, young people who entered monastic life with dreams of serving a higher purpose often found disappointment. The spiritual awakening they sought was buried beneath bureaucracy, politics, and hierarchy. Their days were filled with labor that enriched others. Their questions were discouraged. Their idealism, if it survived at all, had to live in quiet corners of the soul. Still, some resisted. Not every monastery succumbed. Not every voice was silenced. Throughout history, there were those who called for reform, those who remembered the teachings of Christ and the simplicity of early communities. There were monks and nuns who lived lives of genuine compassion, despite the corruption around them. Their efforts were often isolated, but not forgotten. The decline of medieval monasticism was not just the fall of an institution, it was a mirror, held up to humanity, revealing how easily virtue can be compromised when power is left unchecked. And so, as we reflect on these chapters of the past, let us not turn away. Let us look clearly and unflinchingly at what was lost, at the promise that faded, at the voices silenced, and the sacred trust that was traded for influence, because history does not forget. And the lessons carved into cloistered walls still speak if we are willing to listen. Served not as spiritual apprentices, but as unpaid laborers, ensuring the comfort of their superiors, the abbots and priors, entrusted to model lives of humble service. Often acted instead as feudal lords, demanding absolute obedience while answering to no earthly authority. They spoke as though their words carried divine weight, and in a world where contradiction invited peril, few dared to question them. This was not a matter of a few wayward houses. It was systemic, woven into the very structure of medieval religious life. The corruption did not stop at the monastery gate. It extended through every tier of the church, from village priests to powerful cardinals. Abuse was tolerated, grievances silenced, sacred roles exchanged for wealth in plain view. The sale of ecclesiastical offices known as simony had become so common that it no longer shocked. Even more audacious was the sale of indulgences. Certificates that claimed to reduce spiritual penalties in the afterlife. These were sold door to door, marketed with the authority of Rome. The desperate were promised that for the right donation, sins could be washed away and lost loved ones granted peace. Families emptied their savings in hope, unaware that the mercy they believed they had bought was part of a vast economy of spiritual commerce. But the manipulation didn't stop there. Monastic communities, eager to draw pilgrims and offerings, began producing relics of questionable origin. Declared to be from saints, splinters said to be from the true cross, and scraps of fabric promoted as having miraculous contact with sacred figures. Pilgrims journeyed for weeks, sometimes months, to venerate what they believed were holy artifacts, leaving behind offerings that lined the coffers of the abbey. What had once been a sacred mission to preserve knowledge and provide education also fell under the weight of worldly concerns. Rather than share wisdom freely, monasteries hoarded it, maintaining their grip on power through control of literacy and learning. Only texts that reinforced ecclesiastical authority were preserved. Dissenting ideas were silenced, their writings destroyed, their names erased. Even acts of charity, once the proud heart of Christian monasticism, became transactional. The poor were fed, the sick were tended, but always with conditions attached. Aid was distributed in exchange for submission, praise, or silence. Those who questioned treatment or resisted the expected deference found themselves denied help entirely. Mercy, once unconditional, became a tool of reinforcement, and the buildings themselves, their very stones, testified to the shift. The simple chapels of early monks gave way to towering cathedrals and sprawling cloisters. These were no longer shelters of spiritual retreat, they were monuments to ambition. Wealth extracted from the faithful was poured into walls that reached not in humility, but in competition. Each abbey tried to outshine the next. Inside those halls, where monks and nuns were meant to engage in mutual correction and support, silence had been weaponized. Questioning the status quo brought swift punishment. Those who spoke out against the growing excesses of their communities were accused of disobedience or worse, heresy. Trials followed, not in search of truth, but in defense of power. Those convicted faced expulsion or isolation. The very people who were supposed to be spiritual family became instruments of fear. Guest houses meant for hospitality became listening posts. Travelers and pilgrims, thinking they had found sanctuary, were quietly observed. Their loyalties measured, their affiliations reported. Information gathered under the guise of welcome was sold or leveraged in pursuit of greater influence. Even the ancient right of sanctuary, once a sacred promise of protection, was increasingly compromised. Some communities bent to political pressures, allowing refuge seekers to be seized. Others used the presence of fugitives as bargaining chips in their dealings with secular lords. Allegiance to power, not God, dictated outcomes. But perhaps the most tragic failure of all was spiritual. The rhythm of prayer that once filled cloisters with meaning had, in many places, become a rote performance. Words were chanted without thought, rituals completed out of obligation, not reverence. The deep inner life that monasticism was built to cultivate, contemplation, humility, communion with the divine, was replaced by scheduling concerns, business, arrangements, and strategic planning. These were no longer sanctuaries of the soul. They were enterprises, and the currency was influence. Even the mass sacred center of Christian life was affected. Wealthy patrons could pay for masses to be said in their names, or for their deceased. Monks, under pressure to fulfill these contracts, sometimes conducted dozens in a day, racing through ceremonies with little reflection. What was once a holy act became a production line. The confessional, to once a place of healing, was corrupted. Sensitive confessions from the powerful were remembered, not to offer better guidance, but for political advantage. Information whispered in trust was not always held in silence. In some cases, it became a source of leverage. The sacred boundary between priest and penitent was blurred by ambition. Libraries, those great treasures of learning, were not immune. Ancient medical texts that could have improved lives were locked away. Scientific treatises that questioned orthodoxy were hidden or destroyed. Historical records that might have exposed contradictions were edited or concealed. The monasteries, once guardians of light, became gatekeepers of shadows, and even death, that great equalizer, became stratified. The rich were granted ornate funerals, gilded tombs, and promises of eternal prayer so long as generous gifts were made to the religious house. The poor, meanwhile, were given hurried rites and simple burials. The church taught that all souls were equal before God, but the lived reality told a different story. One measured in coin, young people who entered monastic life with dreams of serving a higher purpose often found disappointment. The spiritual awakening they sought was buried beneath bureaucracy, politics, and hierarchy. Their days were filled with labor that enriched others. Their questions were discouraged. Their idealism, if it survived at all, had to live in quiet corners of the soul. Still, some resisted. Not every monastery succumbed. Not every voice was silenced. Throughout history, there were those who called for reform, those who remembered the teachings of Christ and the simplicity of early communities. There were monks and nuns who lived lives of genuine compassion, despite the corruption around them. Their efforts were often isolated, but not forgotten. The decline of medieval monasticism was not just the fall of an institution, it was a mirror, held up to humanity, revealing how easily virtue can be compromised when power is left unchecked. And so, as we reflect on these chapters of the past, let us not turn away. Let us look clearly and unflinchingly at what was lost, at the promise that faded, at the voices silenced, and the sacred trust that was traded for influence, because history does not forget. And the lessons carved into cloistered walls still speak if we are willing to listen. Designed not to foster wisdom or faith, but to suppress independence and exploit labor. Novices were subjected to rigid discipline, constant surveillance, and strict hierarchies meant to erode their sense of self. Creativity and inquiry were discouraged. Those who showed promise were often pressured into joining the very system that stifled them, or quietly cast out. In many cases, monastic life became a choice between compliance and exile, rather than nurturing spiritual leaders. Many communities produced either disillusioned followers or silent accomplices, souls worn thin by a system more concerned with obedience than enlightenment. Women in religious life faced unique challenges. Rather than being treated as spiritual equals, many were regarded as subordinates, subject to the decisions of male superiors who held authority over their convents. Some abbasses who should have protected their sisters instead deferred to corrupt power structures. The stories of women who entered convents with hopes of piety, only to be used for others. Ambitions are painful reminders of how far these institutions sometimes strayed from their ideals. Many nuns found themselves caught between vows they could not escape, and institutions that no longer honored their purpose. With no options beyond the cloister walls, and no recourse within them, their lives became ones of quiet endurance. The very places that should have served as sanctuaries of devotion became, for some gilded cages, charity, once the highest virtue of Christian life, became another tool for controlling the faithful. The poor were aided, but always conditionally expected to express gratitude, accept their place in the social order, and view their suffering as divinely ordained. Still, true justice was seldom pursued. Instead, spiritual leaders promoted patience, obedience, hope for eternal rewards, encouraging submission rather than transformation. The radical message of Christ, which called for justice, humility, and the lifting of the oppressed, was sanitized and reshaped into something safe, something that posed no threat to the powerful and preserved the authority of those in control. This was not the work of a few misguided individuals. It was systemic, institutional, carefully maintained. The men and women entrusted with guiding souls often became stewards of something far more worldly: influence, property, and political relevance. And those who suffered under this betrayal were not only the monks and nuns within, but also the countless lay people who trusted them. Peasants and townspeople turned to these religious orders for spiritual guidance, comfort, and clarity. What they received was often disillusionment. Their sincere faith was repackaged as commerce. Their offerings were counted and stored, their devotion used to sustain structures that no longer lived up to their sacred mission. It was not simply a failure of individual morality, but a dismantling of the very foundations upon which medieval religious life was built. This betrayal of trust would ripple far beyond the cloister walls. Over the centuries, these failures planted seeds of unrest and awakening. As corruption became harder to ignore, calls for reform grew louder. As disillusionment fermented into protest. The Protestant Reformation did not emerge in a vacuum. It was born of accumulated grievances, generational disappointments, and the quiet heartbreak of those who had dared to believe in something higher. What began as whispered doubt eventually became thunderous revolt. At its root lay the unspoken question: what happens when those who speak for God stop listening to him? As the bells of Compline echo across the darkened countryside, calling monks and nuns to their final prayers of the day, we are left to wonder, what words are truly offered in those sacred spaces tonight? Are they prayers of humility, of repentance, of hope? Or are they simply recitations, drained of meaning, echoing off walls that have heard too many hollow vows? The story of medieval monastic corruption is not just a story of greed and decay. It is a story of power, how it tempts, how it transforms, and how it ultimately betrays. Even beyond the monastery gates, the consequences were profound. Families entrusted their children to the care of these institutions. Some hoped for their sons and daughters to rise through the ecclesiastical ranks. Others simply lacked the means to raise them. Oblate's children given over to monasteries at a young age often entered lives shaped more by hierarchy than by compassion, separated from family and identity. Many lived under rules they could neither question nor escape. Over time, these young lives were molded into roles designed to perpetuate the system. Independent thought was discouraged, personal connection minimized, an identity subsumed by obedience. The aim was not enlightenment, but efficiency, while some found genuine meaning within their communities. Many others were shaped by fear of punishment rather than love of God. The scriptorium, once a noble space for learning and preservation, was increasingly repurposed. Instead of illuminating manuscripts to preserve knowledge, monks were directed to manage inventories, craft ledgers, and obscure, inconvenient truths. Records were rewritten, gifts were exaggerated, complaints were buried. The spiritual was replaced with the administrative. Documents reveal how death itself became a tool. Noble patrons paid handsomely for elaborate funeral rites and promises of perpetual prayer. In return, they were granted burial within abbey walls, while the poor were consigned to forgotten plots with few words spoken over their graves. The message was clear. Not even salvation was beyond the reach of economics. Even the architecture told a story. Monasteries rose like fortresses of faith, adorned with stained glass and gold leaf. But behind the beauty, these structures served another function: control. Walls not only kept outsiders at bay, but also locked insiders in. Towers did not just reach for heaven, they cast long shadows over the lives within. Powerful abbots ruled with the authority of kings. They negotiated treaties, raised armies, and influenced royal succession. Papal alliances were brokered in monastic halls. Political scheming was masked as spiritual deliberation. Some monastic orders even operated as transnational networks, their own internal economies, rules of governance, and covert channels of communication. This allowed them to protect themselves, but also to shield their worst actions from the light. And in the rare moments when internal whistleblowers dared speak out, they were met not with gratitude, but with retaliation. Reformers were silenced, critics exiled. Justice was delayed and often denied. Yet still, amidst the shadows, there were flickers of light. Some communities resisted corruption, quietly maintaining lives of discipline and integrity. Some individuals, though surrounded by hypocrisy, clung fiercely to their faith. Reformers emerged often at great personal risk to challenge the decay they saw around them. They wrote letters, preached uncomfortable truths, founded new orders rooted in simplicity and sincerity. Figures like Saint Francis of Assisi and Saint Bernard of Clairvaux tried to call the church back to its foundations. Their voices were not always welcomed, but they endured. And their legacy reminds us that corruption is never absolute. Renewal is always possible. History often remembers the extremes, the extravagance, the scandal, the downfall. But in between those moments were quiet choices, thousands of them made each day by men and women torn between duty and disillusionment. As we close this chapter, we must recognize that the story of medieval monasticism is not just one of failure. It is also a cautionary tale about what happens when institutions meant to elevate the soul become obsessed with protecting their own authority. The real tragedy is not simply that they failed. It is that they convinced the faithful to stop expecting more. And so as the last candles flicker out in those ancient chapels and the corridors fall silent once again, we are left to ask, what kind of holiness did these walls truly witness? They sanctuaries or stages? Did they bring souls closer to the divine, or merely closer to obedience? Most importantly, when faith is wielded as a tool of control, what becomes of the spirit it was meant to nourish? Families. Even confessional records were manipulated to shield the powerful and silence the harmed. What makes this more unsettling is that the church leadership not only knew of these abuses, but actively worked to obscure them. Bishops frequently reassigned known offenders to new monastic communities, effectively offering them fresh victims. Papal letters carried confidential directives that granted high-ranking clergy virtual immunity in exchange for political influence and financial support to Rome. The scale of this corruption was astonishing. Some monasteries operated like medieval criminal syndicates, leveraging their religious influence to launder money, traffic contraband, and suppress dissent. They didn't just control land, they dominated trade networks spanning Europe. Merchants who refused to cooperate might find their goods spoiled, ships sabotaged, or warehouses reduced to ash. These religious orders developed clandestine systems of communication, often disguising their coded instructions as theological discourse. These cryptic messages orchestrated everything from the smuggling of stolen goods to the silencing of witnesses. Excavations of monasteries have unearthed troubling evidence, secret chambers, torture devices, concealed tunnels, and mass graves of those who resisted. Perhaps most horrifying of all was how faith itself became a weapon. Victims were taught that their suffering served a divine purpose, that opposition was sinful, and that speaking up would imperil their souls. This manipulation was so deeply ingrained that some victims came to defend their abusers, convinced their torment was necessary for salvation. This network of corruption infected nearly every aspect of medieval life. Monasteries ran hospitals, which in many cases became places of suffering rather than healing, where the sick and dying were exploited for their remaining assets. They operated schools where education served as indoctrination, and students were taught that unquestioning obedience to authority was the highest virtue. Even death offered no reprieve. Burial grounds were tightly controlled. Families paid exorbitant fees to ensure loved ones received Christian burials. Without payment, the deceased could be consigned to unmarked pits alongside criminals and heretics. Fear of spiritual punishment became a means to extort the living and dishonor the dead. The intellectual devastation was just as severe. Monasteries, once centers of learning, destroyed any text that challenged their authority. Scientific treatises, philosophical works, and historical accounts were lost to flames. These were replaced with propaganda reinforcing their dominance. Medical knowledge suffered immensely. Documents on surgery, pharmaceuticals, and anatomy were obliterated to preserve the Church's monopoly on healing. Rather than safeguard ancient wisdom, these institutions stifled it, condemning Europe to centuries of preventable suffering. Women's monasteries experienced unique brutality. Many nuns lived as prisoners, subject to male authorities who viewed them not as individuals, but as subordinates. Independent or intelligent women were targeted through systematic abuse, forced labor, and starvation. Some convents harbored darker truths: children born of coercion, killed or raised as property within cloistered walls. Even the sacred was corrupted. Fake relics were sold to the desperate, advertised as miracle-working fragments. Fees were collected for prayers never offered, and indulgences were sold like tickets to paradise. Spiritual services became a marketplace of fraud. The psychological toll was profound. Survivors often struggled with lasting trauma, finding it difficult to trust or build stable relationships. Many fell into despair, addiction, or isolation. Their faith, once a source of hope, became a symbol of betrayal. What makes these crimes so heart-wrenching is that they were committed in the name of God. Cloaked in language of compassion and redemption, perpetrators rationalized their actions, believing they were purifying souls or carrying out divine justice. The complicity extended beyond religious walls. Nobles dependent on church favor helped suppress victims. While royal courts feared challenging Rome, medieval power structures became enablers of institutionalized abuse. Surviving financial records reveal an empire built on exploitation. These institutions accumulated immense wealth not through divine providence, but through manipulation and suffering. They thrived in luxury while communities nearby languished in hunger and cold. They preached humility while living in splendor. The deepest tragedy is how this corruption undermined the very idea of spiritual truth. Those seeking divine connection instead found exploitation. The flame of genuine spirituality was nearly extinguished by institutions that claimed to embody it while practicing its opposite. This legacy left generational scars. It influenced the evolution of religion, governance, and social trust. The wounds inflicted by betrayed faith echoed through centuries, fueling skepticism, conflict, and spiritual emptiness. To confront this history is not to reject faith, but to recognize the danger of unchecked power within sacred institutions. These religious orders remind us that those who speak in God's name are not always aligned with true holiness. Their greatest harm was not just in what they did, but in how They destroyed the possibility of authentic community for those who truly believed. Families were left in confusion and silence. Even sacred confessions were manipulated to shield the powerful and silence the wounded. Perhaps most disturbing is that higher authorities within the church not only knew about these wrongs, but, in many cases, helped conceal them. Senior clergy often reassigned problematic individuals to new religious outposts, granting them renewed access to the vulnerable. Sealed letters from Rome sometimes carried privileges that appeared to grant protection to certain elites in return for political loyalty or generous donations. The scale of this hidden economy was staggering. Some monastic networks began operating, less like spiritual communities and more like hidden engines of control, using their influence to move money, goods, and silence across borders. These orders didn't just own land. They managed entire trade routes across the continent. Traders who didn't comply with their demands might find their goods spoiled, their ships wrecked, or their stores destroyed. Within these walls, coded symbols and obscure writings masked instructions for moving contraband or silencing critics, disguised as scholarly or theological exchanges. Modern excavations of old monasteries have revealed disturbing truths, concealed passageways, grim tools, and burial sites holding those who seemingly vanished after opposing the powerful. Yet beyond the physical, what's most haunting is how faith itself was turned into a weapon. Victims were told their pain was sacred, that speaking up meant eternal punishment, and that obedience meant redemption. Such manipulation was so deep that many came to believe their own suffering had purpose, defending those who harmed them out of fear of damnation. This influence spread into every layer of daily life. Monasteries ran hospitals, but some became places where the vulnerable were exploited before being left to die. Their schools turned education into submission training, teaching that unquestioning loyalty was the highest moral path. Even in death, families weren't free. Burial rites were controlled, and grieving relatives were sometimes forced to pay steep fees to avoid having their loved ones cast into anonymous graves among criminals. The very concept of salvation became currency. These places, once seen as sanctuaries of wisdom, also twisted the pursuit of knowledge. They removed and destroyed countless writings that questioned their teachings or exposed uncomfortable truths. Works on science, medicine, history, and philosophy vanished in flames. Of special loss were medical writings, descriptions of surgeries, herbal cures, and human anatomy that could have saved lives, erased from memory to keep spiritual leaders in control of healing. Rather than safeguarding the legacy of the ancients, these institutions suppressed it, plunging Europe into generations of stagnation and preventable suffering. Women faced particular cruelty in many religious communities. Once inside convent walls, many nuns lived in isolation under rigid male authority. Independent or educated women were often broken down through exhausting labor, neglect, or worse. There are accounts of children born under tragic circumstances, either hidden away or subjected to hard servitude within these institutions. Even holy rites were commercialized. Relics were sold to pilgrims as miraculous, regardless of authenticity. Masses were charged for, but never performed. Entire networks profited from forged promises and symbolic favors. The practice of indulgences ballooned into a spiritual marketplace, where those with money could supposedly buy forgiveness. The long-term trauma left by these acts shaped entire generations. Many survivors lived with deep emotional wounds, unable to form trust or find peace. Some fell into destructive behaviors, unable to cope with memories they could not escape. And for many, the very notion of divine love became something to fear. What's most tragic is that all of this was done in the language of compassion. Phrases of mercy and salvation wrapped around acts of control. Abusers sometimes even believed they were doing divine work, claiming suffering had value, or that punishment was part of spiritual purification, and the cover-up extended far beyond the cloisters. Local nobles dependent on religious support often helped bury the truth. Royal courts, afraid of ecclesiastical retaliation, ignored obvious wrongdoing. An entire social and political system became complicit in protecting institutions that had drifted far from their original mission. Financial records from the time revealed just how immense this system became. Vast wealth was not earned through peaceful devotion, but by extracting from the sick, the grieving, and the faithful. These orders lived in great comfort while nearby villages starved, preaching self-denial while draped in luxury. In the end, its betrayal of purpose damaged not just individuals, but entire cultures. People who truly sought meaning or healing were often drawn into structures that took advantage of their sincerity. The genuine search for spiritual truth was dimmed by systems more concerned with preserving their own dominance. The echoes of this era still linger in our social and religious fabric today. The pain left behind shaped attitudes toward power, community, and belief. Cycles of mistrust, pain, and disillusionment were born from these betrayals. To understand this history is not to reject all faith, but to recognize the danger of power without transparency. The medieval church serves as a sobering lesson. Those who claim sacred authority must be held to the highest standards, not the lowest excuses. The deepest harm wasn't just in the acts committed, but in how they shattered the possibility of true healing. Community for generations who came seeking light found only shadows. The church's presence touched every part of medieval Scottish life. But beneath the sacred rituals and ornate robes, a deeper decay festered, one that would shock even the most hardened observers. While sermons praised humility and sacrifice, many clergy dined on lavish feasts, indulging in luxuries, while those outside monastery walls faced hunger and disease. The very individuals meant to guide souls toward grace had, in many cases, turned sacred spaces into centers of worldly ambition where salvation seemed to carry a price tag. Within the quiet halls of Scotland's abbeys, vows once spoken with sincerity were often abandoned. Some leaders lived lives that contradicted the very principles they preached. The abbot of Melrose, once revered, became a figure of controversy. His influence protected more by fear than faith. Allegations were met not with transparency, but with threats, warnings of spiritual condemnation used to silence concern. The church, meant to protect, at times, failed its most vulnerable followers. Forgiveness, once freely offered, became transactional. The practice of indulgences evolved into a troubling economy where wealth could seemingly buy divine favor, while the poor were left with empty hands and unanswered prayers. Bishop William Sinclair of Dunkeld amassed significant wealth through religious transactions. He commissioned lavish estates adorned with imported finery, funded by coins offered in hope, fear, and desperation by ordinary believers. Many monks began to reflect the excesses of secular courts rather than the humility of sacred service. Some leaders hosted elaborate celebrations while the sick waited at their gates. These excesses stood in stark contrast to the foundational values of love, humility, and care. Even more unsettling were reports of secretive rituals within certain orders, gatherings that blurred the line between reverence and superstition. Whispers circulated about ceremonies that diverged sharply from established tradition, raising questions about the direction these groups had taken. Women faced distinct challenges within the religious system. While some found genuine purpose in their calling, others were subject to unjust treatment. At the convent of North Berwick, troubling disappearances gave rise to rumors and fear. When families sought answers, they were often met with vague explanations. Cloaked in religious mystique, faith was used not to illuminate, but to obscure. In the realm of commerce, contradictions deepened. Though publicly opposing the trade in human lives, some institutions engaged in covert transactions, treating individuals as property rather than souls. Certain monastic centers in Scotland were linked to labor systems that moved people across borders under religious cover. Its disconnect between principle and practice revealed a system where moral clarity had often given way to self-interest. Even sacred rites were sometimes exploited. Families reported being asked to pay for corrected ceremonies when initial sacraments were performed improperly. Weddings, baptisms, and even funerals became entangled with monetary demands. The church, meant to shepherd souls, had in some places become more gatekeeper than guide. Visiting church officials, sent from abroad to supervise local clergy, often mirrored the same patterns. Cardinal Beaton, for example, lived with such opulence that it rivaled royalty. His court was known for excess, drawing criticism from both the devout and the disillusioned. Feasts, entertainment, and luxury flourished even as commoners struggled. The monastic libraries and learning centers, once renowned for their preservation of knowledge, had in some cases shifted focus from enlightenment to control, rather than encouraging inquiry. Some scriptoria prioritized maintaining authority. Important manuscripts challenging dominant doctrine were quietly suppressed or destroyed, replaced with texts that reinforced the existing hierarchy. Objects considered sacred were also not immune to doubt. Pilgrims traveled far to venerate relics, many of which were later questioned for their authenticity. One relic, long believed to be a piece of Christ's cross, was ultimately revealed to be crafted from common oak. The monk who made the discovery died shortly after under circumstances that sparked more questions than answers. The tithing system, originally designed to support community needs, became increasingly burdensome. Families were expected to contribute not just money, but also goods, animals, and even labor. Young men entered religious service under the promise of spiritual elevation, only to find themselves performing grueling work with little hope of escape. The church's appetite for growth often came at the expense of those it claimed to uplift. Even confessionals, intended as places of healing, became instruments of influence. Clergy, entrusted with the innermost truths of their communities, sometimes used that knowledge not for guidance but for leverage. Personal secrets became quiet tools of control, fostering dependence and fear rather than liberation. These weren't isolated abuses. They formed a broader pattern. The church's influence extended far beyond its spiritual role, entwined deeply with the political and economic structures of the time. Abbots and bishops lived like feudal lords, surrounded by grandeur, while their flocks lived in poverty. Religious teachings were invoked not to inspire, but to enforce. Within cloistered halls, wealth and status determined spiritual authority. Abbesses appointed from powerful families lived lives of comfort behind walls meant for devotion. Some monks neglected their spiritual duties altogether, spending time in local taverns rather than in contemplation. Confession itself became commodified, a place where wrongdoing could be washed away, not through repentance but through payment. Far from being moral compasses, many in religious leadership preyed on the very people who turned to them in need. Libraries meant to preserve knowledge became curated vaults, hiding ideas that could disrupt their control. Scientific advancements and philosophical texts were either hidden away or lost entirely. The control of thought became just as vital as the control of land or wealth. Truth itself was filtered. Knowledge that didn't conform to the church's narrative was erased or rewritten. Intellectual gatekeeping ensured that few questioned what they were taught, and fewer still knew what they were missing. The young were especially vulnerable. Orphans entrusted to religious care often became unpaid laborers. Novices endured harsh discipline under the banner of spiritual training. Punishments were harsh, obedience was mandatory, and emotional trauma often went unrecognized and unhealed. The sacred vows of religious life, poverty, chastity, obedience, were frequently honored in word but ignored in action. Scandals involving clergy fathering children or secret affairs in convents were not unheard of. Rules were bent, broken, or ignored entirely. With silence enforced through hierarchy, the deeper issue wasn't individual failure, it was systemic. Erosion. Entire institutions functioned more like powerful estates than spiritual communities. Land was acquired through pressure, gifts, and sometimes manipulation. The dying were convinced to donate estates in exchange for promised salvation. Widows were urged to surrender inheritance rights under spiritual duress. As land and power grew, so did construction. Cathedrals rose skyward, funded by the labor and sacrifice of peasants who had little choice but to contribute. Builders, driven to meet tight deadlines and budgets, sometimes cut corners, risking collapse. The grandeur of the church often stood in stark contrast to the daily suffering that made it possible. In the scriptoria, monks worked long hours in poor conditions. They copied sacred texts with great care but little compensation. Their health deteriorated from exposure to hazardous inks and pigments, and their physical suffering was quietly dismissed as a necessary sacrifice. The books they created sold for immense profit. Though the scribes themselves often lived and died in hardship, even the church's efforts at charity were sometimes undercut by ulterior motives. Hospitals were run less for healing than for conversion. Medical practices often prioritized religious tradition over evidence-based care. Those who questioned methods or sought alternatives were silenced or ostracized. Pilgrim routes became lucrative opportunities for exploitation. Monasteries charged heavily for food, shelter, and blessings, capitalizing on the faith and desperation of weary travelers. Relics were mass-produced and sold to those who believed they were touching the divine. At every stop, a system thrived on deception and shattered hopes. Pilgrims unable to pay were abandoned to the mercy of bandits and wild beasts, their beliefs no shield against greed. Religious institutions also played an ominous political role. Trading influence for wealth, abbots and bishops became power brokers, manipulating disputes and successions to serve their interests. They exposed confessional secrets to undermine enemies and allies alike, turning sacred trust into a tool of control. The Church's supposed moral leadership was a facade for deeply unethical actions. Its educational systems raised followers, not thinkers. Monastic schools emphasized rote memorization of scripture and punished curiosity. The brightest students were either absorbed into the machinery or cast out. Independent thought was a threat. Women bore the brunt of this control. Convents became prisons. Abbesses imposed harsh punishments masked as piety. Teachings of female inferiority justified cruelty, creating a culture where suffering was deemed holy. The sale of indulgences reached grotesque levels. Forgiveness had a price tag, accessible only to the wealthy, while the poor faced damnation. The spiritual economy revealed priorities rooted not in salvation, but in profit. The Church also led violent purges against ancient practices, branding healers as witches and erasing cultural heritage. Only sanctioned beliefs survived, reducing spiritual diversity to ruin. Church-run courts enforced fear. Trials were secretive. Confessions obtained under torture. Accused individuals disappeared from records as though they never existed. As we examine this bleak history, we see religious orders preaching love while practicing cruelty, claiming divine purpose while serving their own ends. Monasteries outwardly holy hid widespread corruption. Vows of poverty and chastity masked lives of luxury, exploitation, and unchecked power. Lavish abbots lived richly while extracting impossible tithes from peasants, seizing land when payments failed. The sale of clerical positions simony was rampant. Sacred rolls were purchased, passed through corrupt families, their holders. Using faith as a shield for personal gain, the vulnerable were preyed upon. Children sent to monasteries became victims of unchecked abuse, their suffering silenced or blamed on them. Entire networks thrived on false relics, staged miracles, and faked piety to extract money from desperate pilgrims. Convents offered no refuge for women either. Forced into religious life, they endured starvation, humiliation, and abuse. Under the guise of salvation, medical care was another front for cruelty. Monks, untrained in healing, performed brutal procedures, denied pain relief, and let the poor die for lack of payment. Knowledge was destroyed, libraries burned, texts suppressed, thinkers silenced to maintain control. Monasteries enforced ignorance, and loyalty through isolation, manipulation, and fear. Abbeys waged wars, manipulated thrones, and committed political assassinations. Their supposed neutrality was a lie. Even charity masked exploitation. Orphanages became labor camps. Hospitals segregated rather than healed. Religious immunity protected vast networks of deceit and suffering. Novices were broken mentally and physically, subjected to rituals that erased individuality. Silence was used to isolate. Sleep deprivation and food manipulation were common tools. Confessionals became surveillance devices. Children were told their pain pleased God, Even the dead were exploited, their bodies altered to create profitable. Saints' corruption reached every corner, education twisted to preserve obedience. Libraries doctored to erase inconvenient truths, political conspiracies staged in cloisters. Healing knowledge was suppressed, the centers were crushed, and former monks, scarred by trauma, often lived broken lives beyond monastery walls. The institutions built to guide souls became machines of pain. Betraying their original mission, they sowed suffering instead of salvation. Their legacy still haunts us, a warning that those who cloak themselves in righteousness can wield the most dangerous power. These religious orders remind us that when institutions stop serving people and serve only themselves, they become forces of devastation. As the medieval era waned, these orders faced their reckoning. By the 14th and 15th centuries of abuse had sparked rebellion. The faithful, once reverent, now viewed monasteries with distrust. The Great Schism had already fractured papal unity, exposing the politics beneath the piety. The stage was set for collapse. At every stop, a system thrived on deception and shattered hopes. Pilgrims unable to pay were abandoned to the mercy of bandits and wild beasts, their beliefs no shield against greed. Religious institutions also played an ominous political role. Trading influence for wealth, abbots and bishops became power brokers, manipulating disputes and successions to serve their interests. They exposed confessional secrets to undermine enemies and allies alike, turning sacred trust into a tool of control. The Church's supposed moral leadership was a facade for deeply unethical actions. Its educational systems raised followers, not thinkers. Monastic schools emphasized rote memorization of scripture and punished curiosity. The brightest students were either absorbed into the machinery or cast out. Independent thought was a threat. Women bore the brunt of this control. Convents became prisons. Abbesses imposed harsh punishments masked as piety. Teachings of female inferiority justified cruelty, creating a culture where suffering was deemed holy. The sale of indulgences reached grotesque levels. Forgiveness had a price tag accessible only to the wealthy, while the poor faced damnation. This spiritual economy revealed priorities rooted not in salvation, but in profit. The Church also led violent purges against ancient practices, branding healers as witches and erasing cultural heritage. Only sanctioned beliefs survived, reducing spiritual diversity to ruin. Church-run courts enforced fear. Trials were secretive. Confessions obtained under torture. Accused individuals disappeared from records, as though they never existed. As we examine this bleak history, we see religious orders preaching love while practicing cruelty, claiming divine purpose while serving their own ends. Monasteries, outwardly holy, hid widespread corruption. Vows of poverty and chastity masked lives of luxury, exploitation, and unchecked power. Lavish abbots lived richly while extracting impossible tithes from peasants, seizing land when payments failed. The sale of clerical positions simony was rampant. Sacred roles were purchased, passed through corrupt families, their holders. Using faith as a shield for personal gain, the vulnerable were preyed upon. Children sent to monasteries became victims of unchecked abuse, their suffering silenced or blamed on them. Entire networks thrived on false relics, staged miracles, and faked piety, all to extract money from desperate pilgrims. Convents offered no refuge for women either. Forced into religious life, they endured starvation, humiliation, and abuse. Under the guise of salvation, medical care was another front for cruelty. Monks, untrained in healing, performed brutal procedures, denied pain relief, and let the poor die for lack of payment. Knowledge was destroyed. Libraries burned, texts suppressed, thinkers silenced to maintain control. Monasteries enforced ignorance and loyalty through isolation, manipulation, and fear. Abbeys waged wars, manipulated thrones, and committed political assassinations. Their supposed neutrality was a lie. Even charity masked exploitation. Orphanages became labor camps. Hospitals segregated rather than healed. Religious immunity protected vast networks of deceit and suffering. Novices were broken mentally and physically subjected to rituals that erased individuality. Silence was used to isolate. Sleep deprivation and food manipulation were common tools. Confessionals became surveillance devices. Children were told their pain pleased God. Even the dead were exploited, their bodies altered to create profitable. Saints' corruption reached every corner, education twisted to preserve obedience. Libraries doctored to erase inconvenient truths, political conspiracies staged in cloisters. Healing knowledge was suppressed. Dissenters were crushed. And former monks, scarred by trauma, often lived broken lives beyond monastery walls. The institutions built to guide souls became machines of pain. Betraying their original mission, they sowed suffering instead of salvation. Their legacy still haunts us, a warning that those who cloak themselves in righteousness can wield the most dangerous power. These religious orders remind us that when institutions stop serving people and serve only themselves, they become forces of devastation. As the medieval era waned, these orders faced their reckoning. By the 14th and 15th centuries of abuse had sparked rebellion. Faithful, once reverent, now viewed monasteries with distrust. The Great Schism had already fractured papal unity, exposing the politics beneath the piety. The stage was set for collapse. Witnesses to ecclesiastical conflict watched with disbelief as rival popes excommunicated one another, abandoning humility for ambition. This crisis of legitimacy opened the door for reformers. The printing press, invented in the mid-15th century, became a powerful tool for change. It enabled the widespread distribution of critical texts, exposing corruption beyond the Church's control. Pamphlets detailed scandals. Translations of Scripture let ordinary people engage with spiritual teachings directly, bypassing compromised intermediaries. The Renaissance and its humanist ideals brought rigorous inquiry to religious claims. Scholars began challenging forged documents, false relics, and distorted doctrine. Their investigations undermined the Church's historical narrative and exposed its manipulation of truth. Economically, new urban centers and banking systems eroded the Church's financial dominance. Guilds and merchants rose in power, questioning ecclesiastical monopolies. Secular universities offered learning that rivaled monastic schools, prioritizing critical thinking over dogma. The trauma of the Black Death had already laid bare the Church's inadequacies. Instead of comfort, many religious leaders fled or exploited the crisis, contrasting sharply with civic leaders who stayed to help. Reformers within the Church, Franciscan spirituals, honest Dominicans, were often silenced, proving that reform from within had become nearly impossible. Efforts like the Conciliant movement sought change through official channels, but were thwarted by entrenched interests. This failure strengthened calls for radical reform. Women, long silenced, began to speak. Mystics like Catherine of Siena and Bridget of Sweden used their respected voices to denounce corruption. Their visions inspired broader resistance. Lay religious movements also emerged. Groups like the Brethren of the Common Life emphasized personal devotion and moral living, independent of clerical mediation. Literature joined the outcry. Works like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales satirized corrupt clergy. Folk stories and songs echoed public disillusionment. Meanwhile, rising nation-states challenged religious dominance. Monarchs began to seize church lands and reassert control, diminishing ecclesiastical power. These changes set the stage for the seismic shifts of the Protestant Reformation. In the 16th century, the Reformation delivered a decisive blow. Its criticisms resonated deeply, reflecting grievances long felt by the people. In Protestant regions, monasteries were dissolved. Their wealth redistributed, though not always to the poor, marked the end of an era. Even the Catholic Church, through the Counter-Reformation, acknowledged the need for reform. The Council of Trent imposed stricter discipline, founded new orders with greater accountability, and tried to prevent the return of past abuses. The legacy of monastic corruption shaped modern thought. Enlightenment philosophers used it as evidence for religious tolerance, separation of church and state, and individual freedom. It became a case study in the dangers of concentrated power. Trust in religious authority, once absolute, was permanently altered. People learned to question institutions that claimed moral superiority. This shift helped birth democratic ideals and modern governance. Economically, removing monastic control over land and wealth allowed growth and innovation. In education, the end of monastic monopolies led to curricula based on inquiry and science. This change fueled the scientific revolution. Politically, it showed the necessity of checks on religious influence. Artistically, disillusionment inspired new expressions. Writers and painters turned inward, exploring personal faith over institutional dogma. This cultural transformation helped ignite the Renaissance. Looking back, we see not just abuse, but a warning. Institutions that lose sight of their purpose become instruments of harm. The medieval religious orders, corrupted by unchecked authority, betrayed the very values they were founded on. Their downfall was inevitably earned by centuries of neglect, exploitation, and silence. Today, their story remains a cautionary tale. Power must always be accountable. Righteousness must be grounded in action, not title. And the lessons of the past must never be forgotten, lest we allow history's shadows to return.